This is Dave Monk, Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board.
And sort of we have a mission of environmentalism and sort of what's happened on the street in the last little while. It's been kind of busy. Kind of a memorial for Memorial Day on Monday. Mike and Molly's has closed out and has had a lot of people there. Mike has a background of this community. His mother is a Sullivan. His father has been into a whole bunch of things in this town. And it's sad that he's going. I hope he finds an opportune situation. It's a little hard for bars to stay afloat and to also be interesting. There's a competition. The more bars you put up, the more there is a competition, and at some stages, some bars will move out, and that's sort of the policy of a laissez-faire for the city. Carlos and Tiffany and Marco will take over from next door, the Seven Saints, and already that's been happening. I've been salvaging from both units as Mike and Molly's closed out and as Carlos and Marco and Tiffany moved in. There's a large gondola sitting outside, and I've been checking that out and taking steel to the recycling and preserving the dignity of things that could be recycled. I took a bowling ball and other things to Habitat. Some things of interest go to, that are items of artistic interest, go to the Idea Store, which is running fabric at the present time. Other things go to Goodwill, which takes fabric, incidentally, and that is helpful because somehow it gets to be a lot of abandoned fabric, dresses and jeans and shoes and all sorts of things that could be reused. I'm just looking at my notes here. Oh, plastic beer kegs. In Europe, you wouldn't get away with not salvaging plastic beer kegs. I've found a place for them, and so they will be recycled. But in this community, we don't do that. We don't have a good recycling for rather hard plastic. Other things happening, the Conservation District in Vermilion County has had a 50-year celebration, and Ken Consis has been there for a long time. And we have Doris Westfield Perry, which is, and Marilyn Campbell and others over there have done lots to get natural areas in that community. A lot of things happen on the street. I had a guy came by. He's been a Champaign barber, but he now spends his winters in Panama. He has a back problem, and it doesn't do so well in the winter, but he does very well in the rainforest. Rainforest is kind of marvelous because it just is loaded with prairies and with birds. I grew up with semi-tropical rainforest, and we could have paradise bird for sitting on the fence at breakfast time, and other exotic creatures that you don't usually get except in the tropics. We're losing the tropics fast, fast, fast. I had an occasion to call Uline this week because I pull Uline catalogs out of the dumpster regularly, and these are brand new catalogs, and every issue of the Uline catalog must take out a big chunk of rainforest. So, but it was also a thing about wheels. We often get chairs that have wheel problems just because the hair is caught in them. So I called up Uline because they distribute a whole bunch of furniture which has wheels on it, whether it's a chair or whether it's a rolling mop bucket. Often one wheel gets hair in it, won't turn, so the instrument gets dragged across the floor and has a flat side, a square wheel, in other words. I wanted to ask if that organization couldn't put forth a $10,000 to an engineering company, engineering grad student, to institute a wheel that could have the axle removed so that the hair in the wheel could be removed. You can spend at least $15 worth of time fiddling around with caustic soda or knives and all sorts of things to try and get the hair out of there. But just to have an axle that would be removable is a possibility. They can provide replacement wheels, but they're costly, and it's not necessary. So we had this back and forth, and I didn't get to the management because I wasn't allowed to get to the management. But certainly that's not left my purvey. David had his hand up, and you were going to say something.
No, I was actually just tightening things around here. Everything in the booth gets used so consistently, so regularly, that it starts to come loose. And one of my things that I've always done, even since before I was the interim station manager, is you automatically tighten things to make sure that when somebody's here, they don't fall down. That's the reason that you saw my hand up there.
Okay.
Back to your story.
David often has a word or two, and that's very interesting usually. So that's why I stopped. So the barber came by, and then two young women came by and took a tour of the pocket prairie, wanted to know what the word pocket meant for pocket prairie, and we had to explain that that's a small prairie or small pocket of vegetation or relief in an urban setting. A husband and wife and child came by. They'd done a field trip a year ago, and that sort of thing constantly happens. And so we're very glad to have to meet with City Dictates. I've removed most of the planters in the street. So for this year, the first time for a long, long time, we don't have a whole bunch of flowering plants in the street. It makes it rather sterile. It kind of is disappointing, and saves me about $200 worth of finance to do that, and it saved me a lot of time watering plants during the summer. But it really is part of the character of this street and has been for about 30 years. We find wedding groups come to be photographed here. There was another one on Saturday. It's just a few older buildings, not gentrified yet, and that provides character and interaction. I went to the farmers market, the Champaign farmers market. Champaign farmers market has moved from place in the middle of Neal Street when there was a mall there to behind the Coons building, to the other side of First Street, other side of the railroad line. It's been all over. It lacks the pizzazz of the Havana Farmers Market. There's not the same sort of relaxation, and it will take a long time. It's a little bit like the streetscape being cleaned up. It just takes away a little of the character. I did go to the farmers market after we had a torrential downpour. There was water everywhere. Any bucket that you had around had about an inch of rain in it over a very short period. When I got to the farmers market, there were two booths left, and they were sort of soaking wet, a little bit like tropical rainforest, where you allow your clothes to get wet and you dry them on you. But one was the Joy group. They are a little farm. If you go out Bradley Avenue and go west a long way to Route 47 going north, you'll find a little family of goats and that natural history and a family that grows things. And one time, quite a while ago, I was asked to do a 4-H thing there, and they picked seed and they took some home, and some of it included little blue stem. So now that family has little blue stem in their 15-acre lot or whatever it is. So they were there and selling cookies and garlic and spring onions and sweets, and we had a very friendly talk, and that's sort of what the farmers market is about. There's been window replacements around the corner. We have one window that's been falling out, and Kim Campbell has been helping me with that. But what used to be Rubel's sound studio is having replacement windows. I suspect there are 3 triple panes, environmental. So there's a gondola to take that now, and there is a man lift there, and I'm wondering if they could come around the corner and work on my fronts. But you know, it's got to go through all the hoopla to get there. So I'm just looking at so we got 2 gondolas. A gondola is a very big trash can. One's brand new and orange and it looks really interesting. That's taking the windows. The windows with wood on them are not awfully easy to send out as salvage anywhere. The salvage companies won't take them. You've got to break the glass out of them, but that seems sad when they're big pieces of glass. And I'm not quite sure where all these windows are going to go to, but I suspect they'll go to the landfill. Some of them have arched frames, which if you had to get a carpenter to do that, that's rather difficult to do, so that's a costly business. But we chat. That's part of this whole street, is that people talk to each other and do interesting things. The 2 young women that came, one had a background in Wisconsin, one had a background in Florida. So we talked about the Everglades, we talked about Eau Claire and Wisconsin, and Phillips way up there north. And they had a dog, a friendly dog, and we just brief interlude, but the sort of thing that makes Market Street possible. I'm looking at my notes here. Oh, I was watching televisions because televisions are not allowed to be in the landfill anymore, and that was it's a very good interpretation to put your computer or your television set in the dumpster that goes to Clinton. We don't need it. Lynn Wolfell wrote an article to the newspaper. I read the newspaper, trying to get these sorts of things. Lynn has been a farmer of note, a board member of the Parkland College, a poet, and he has a number of children, he and his wife, and one of them is an entrepreneur with stage lighting and stage operations, and I think one of the things he's doing is with pappardelles. So the family is interesting. What Lynn was writing about was he wants to see students have more opportunity for creativity. It's often we have classes and the classes don't necessarily relate to the real world. I'm interested to see that the engineers and the finance people, the business people, business college, have gotten together with a new program where they're inviting people to be entrepreneurs, the people who have an idea that they would like to develop for public presentation. So that's now, I think, a degree program. And I applaud that. I think that's very good. So this is the sort of person that goes to Parkland, has an opportunity to have one leg in the real world and be a business person, but has the opportunity to dream take courses that might be computer courses or might be art courses, get heads together, and then have a transfer to the University of Illinois and be able to take a series of courses that result in a degree that is going to help those sorts of people into the world at large. And it's remarkable, a number of people who are engineers and others who have gone on to produce a product or an idea that has lasted for a long time. The College of Media is having some difficulties. The press people, all told, have had a problem because the internet is much more instantaneous. It's often more formal. You can't hide your thought in a piece of paper. This is going to be going on your cell phone to whoever. So quickly, so the whole communications operation has changed some. And so how do we keep groups like WIL and WFT together to do interesting community action things? And WEFT especially is a very, very good radio station that produces music presented by people who know their onions and know how to interpret the music, and that's tremendous. But in there somewhere, we need to do community things, and I'm interested to see that more and more the Urbana Public Television is coming in and videotaping things. So we not only have a radio program, but we have a video program. And that runs back to the colleges of media or communications that have to do the theory behind how we think and dream. Buildings are going up everywhere, and it requires more zoning, especially if you want to know what height you'd send that building to. Do you have a fire department that can get up there, or do you have a razor that can, water razor or pipe that can take water to a 10th story? Or where do you put your high-rise buildings? You put them on University Avenue. University Avenue is becoming a very closely knit territory. It's very little setback, so you be in a tunnel, and one has to wonder if there are enough students to occupy those buildings, or if there are enough students that have low income that could occupy those buildings. We suspect there's no problem with fairly wealthy students to occupy these buildings, but the question is whether the Latinos or the black community gets to use those buildings. Underneath them there will be stores, and they will make money, but right behind them is a different fall off into a community that does not have much money. So how do we balance those things out is a question. I want to remind you that the North American Prairie Conference is coming up, and one of the things that interests me is the Kankakee Sands. I have an evil thought that in the long run we might have a national park coming from Kankakee through to Rantoul or perhaps even Champaign. You would get off at a little south of Kankakee, and you would look at the Kankakee Sands, because the sands were blown across as Lusa when the glacial meltways dried up, and so they're also bottomlands, shallows, and sort of swamplands. And there's was a move to get the federal government to buy that whole Kankakee Valley for a large national park, which would demonstrate the fact that there are some places in the glaciation that are sand prairies, and some of them are swamplands, and that didn't happen. But slowly, there's a woman named Ham, H-A-H-N, that has an organization that is gradually buying up some of this land, and we hope that they'll eventually get that in total. And I'll be taking that as a first choice field trip on the Tuesday of the North American Prairie Conference, and I will be going to the Kankakee Marsh. There's already an Iroquois conservation area which has some of the same territory. It's quite different. It's a dry oak area, and it's interesting enough that one of the royalty from, I think, King George V, perhaps, would come here to be in that area and hunt animals that are peculiar to that sort of situation. There's a friendly soul that is at Beckman, and she's retiring. She's a relative of the morning restaurant that's around the corner, the Gus's Sam's restaurant, and she's been at Beckman for 20 years, but she's gotten to know everyone, and that's what makes things friendly. Now, let me see the time. Let's look at Elizabeth Hanson. Elizabeth Hanson died just recently at the age of 98. And she is a quiet, friendly powerhouse. And she grew up with an academic family in Missouri. Her father, named Miller, was a soil scientist, but he was also dean of the College of Agriculture. Her mother was a botanist with a background in Nebraska, as far as I can tell, which is a short grass prairie, but the family was certainly into being curious about their environment. Elizabeth had three brothers that all went into physics or other academic situations, but she didn't do that. Not that it would be easy for her to do that. She had 4 children herself, and but she married a physicist, and she'd been at the University of Wisconsin, and he was eventually part of the Manhattan Project and went to Los Alamos, and so she has that experience of almost a desert situation, and then they invited her to come back to Champaign. And I encountered Elizabeth because I was poking around at these little remnants, and there's a little Western cemetery just south of Paxton, and Elizabeth had found that there was native prairie in one corner of a sort of set-aside area, and the little creek running through, and on the edge of it was prairie. And so she managed to figure out a dogleg fence, and she and her husband, you would go there. And there were things that were quite unusual at that time for Champaign County. Now we plant things like Bootaloo, but Sardos was actually in that cemetery. And so Elizabeth was in Champaign County for 70 years. And she had a sort of graphic arts, cartography, natural history bent, and would encourage curiosity in the family. A little bit like Lynn Walfer wanted to encourage independent thought and creativity. The family got the message. And she, after 20 years of being here, she discovered that her great-grandfather, great-grandfather, had come from Ohio. This is kind of interesting because Champaign-Urbana seems to have attracted quite a few people from Ohio. You go to Ohio, you find Urbana, Ohio, you find Champaign County, Ohio. These people came. Interesting enough, the titles came, and it went from man to man. It didn't go to the females of the family. We were still in that era when it was pretty much male domination, but they came. And great-grandfather settled out there by White Heath, where we do a lot of our work. And so Elizabeth got involved in what was here. Yeah. Her father used to go to meetings, and he has a poem here that I will attempt to read. The Last of the Virgin Soil by Rudolph Rusty. We broke today on the homestead the last of the virgin sod, and a haunting feeling oppressed me that we marred a work of God. A fragrance rose from the furrow, a fragrance both fresh and old. It was fresh with the dew of morning, yet aged with time untold. The creak of leather and clevis, the rip of the coulter blade, and we wreck what God with the labor of a million years has made. I thought while laying the last land of the tropical sun and rains, of the jungles, glaciers, and oceans which had helped to make these plains, of monsters horrid and fearful, we reigned in the land we plough, and it seemed to me so presumptuous of man to claim it now. So when today on the homestead we finished the virgin sod, is it strange I almost regretted to have marred that work of God? At a conference of agricultural extension in 1937, that was said. So, yes, we still feel that. And Elizabeth started to be interested in the cemeteries, now a little bit more, because the Ohio types, not unusually, the people who go west sometimes go back east. and they may have relatives and friends that are in hard times, or there may be some political situation. But great-grandfather went back to Ohio, and Elizabeth didn't know that for 20 years, but then she found out. And so she has a book that we have a donated copy, and it's East Central Illinois Exploring the Beginnings. Landforms and Ecosystems. That's what was there. Territory to public domain. That's that takeover. And then wilderness to real estate. What the heck is left? She has a logo on the front which has a prairie on one side and a corn plant on the other. And she has a picture inside that has a field of corn and a prairie on the other side. And I think that's rather nice. We'll see if we can't put it up. And so there's the tall, big blue stem and the multi-diverse prairie alongside the monoculture. And the monoculture is so dominant. She deals with the Prairie Peninsula, which runs out into Ohio and back towards the Colorado. She deals especially with Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. And within that framework, she deals especially with East Central Illinois. And she looks at the bedrock, glacial till, and the lush that covered that when the glaciers dried up and the meltways, the sand was blown to places like Kankakee. Some of the bedrock has faults where plate tectonics have moved, and you may have accumulated Carboniferous ages where you have Carboniferous plants that, when compressed, make coal. So we have places like Danville where there's coal. We're even doing battle with a bulldog mine that's proposed to go in the southeast corner of Champaign County and the southwest corner of Vermilion County. And the big questions about where the coal gets washed and how it gets washed and whose water it gets washed with and what aquifer it comes from, and how we might be able to discuss that without lack of transparency. So it's very awkward for the Department of Natural Resources because they both control the mining and the natural history and the water. So big questions here. We're dealing with tall grass prairie. It was a wet prairie, so Rantoul area was the Grand Prairie of East Central Illinois. It's an ecosystem that's supported by fire, but Smokey the Bear was around and we didn't have fires, so sometimes we have huge fires because we haven't had a sensible fire for a number of years, and the sensible fire keeps the prairie intact, because after thousands of years of experience of fire, the prairie plants have not only gotten used to being fired, they'll jolly well enjoy it and adapt to it. And so if you don't burn it, then your prairie will become depauperate and become an annual and poop out. So we need that prairie as a gene pool. We have counterpart grasslands in the pampas in South America and in the steppes in Russia, but we don't have a lot of this sort of ecosystem around the world. So in effect, we have one of the world's biggest ecosystems and one of the least preserved ecosystems in the world. And so we have a responsibility to do something about this. And Elizabeth Hanson's interest was in letting the public know what was there so that they could help to preserve this. Comes Manifest Destiny, which says that if God says that I can use your territory better than someone else, then we have the God-given right to take it over and do what we want with it. And that has been a little cruel. It meant that Indian territory from 1600s on to 1800s was sort of, Indians were forced west, and they were often in conflict with each other because they were moving west into each other's territories. The way that Indians operated was often to have an ecological use of the territory, whereas the entrepreneurs that came in often wanted one species that would give capital gain. So if you wanted tall trees for masts for sailing ships, then you grew tall trees, or you harvested tall trees for masts and didn't worry about the total ecosystem. So it wasn't only moving Indians off the territory, it was changing the ecosystem from east to west. There's the wilderness problems which come with that. There are flyways that go up through the country to the north and through the Mississippi Valley. And Elizabeth was interested in those too. The military came through, and not very many people stopped in Vermilion County. Vermilion County had some advantages. They had a different basic rock underneath and some salt. So salt was an advantage. It preserved things and was useful in that sense. But most of Champaign County, which was part of Vermilion County, was very, very wet. It generated malaria, and but eventually Champaign County was cut off from Vermilion County. The military moved through Champaign County and Vermilion County to Fort Clark, which was basically Peoria on the Illinois River. So that history was there. There were various moves afloat to make it more convenient for people to gather land and know where it was, especially if they were buying it from Europe. There were sections or miles. A section is mile by mile. There were townships, which are 36 square miles, and there are counties of varying size. So there was a law set down as to how people could acquire their land, sometimes for 7 cents an acre. Some land did not sell very easily because it was wet on the banks of the Sangamon or Kaskaskia or Ombra or the Vermilion rivers. So those sometimes were platted lands that didn't sell very well, and they weren't very easy to plat square north, south, east, and west according to a Jeffersonian plat. So when you get to these areas, the roads get to be more aligned to the rivers, and conservation easements are possible in those areas. Grand Prairie Ferns has been buying up some of those lands even yet because they still remain forested on the banks of the Ombra and other river bases. So then we gradually got towns, and we got railroads, and we got interurbans, and interurbans came with electricity. So just this week I've been talking to the Forest Preserve about the possibility of working with Ameren to extend the 100 feet wide corridor that's becoming a Kickapoo Trail, to widen it by about 40 feet to allow Prairie especially to survive. I've had quite a few conversations, and so have other people, because the 20-year-old trees are coming out. It's taken 20 years for us to gather up locally, regionally, state-wise, and federally, to gather up the rail bed and to convert it into an interim trail. The Cross Construction Company, which is the contractor on this rail bed, has now removed the trees with a fairly heavy piece of equipment which puts its hydraulic arms around a tree and cuts it off at the bottom and then stacks it in a nice stack, and along comes a chipping machine which probably got 1,000 horsepower engine, and it chomps up a tree that might be 6 or 8 or 10 inches in diameter. But every tree I've been reading the base of is about 20 years old, and they're all crud trees which have come in and invaded the prairie. The prairie also goes out onto the interurban. So we've been having discussions about what we might be able to do to perhaps extend the friendship of the prairie. And that's about where Elizabeth Hanson comes in. She rustled up little cemetery prairies, and sometimes you couldn't drive into them, you couldn't walk into them. They're isolated in the farms, but she knew that these were stalwarts of preservation of prairie plants. A little place at Royal, a little place at Penfield, south at Western and Northern, another place. These are places that are cared for by groups like the Grand Prairie Friends, and they are refuges of good quality prairie, or unique prairie, and sometimes endangered species. She'd also look at waterways and where the water was going, and that includes the Illinois River and the Mississippi River. Sometimes, as progress came by, you had sewage to deal with, and the question is, do you put the sewage into the Lake Michigan, or do you climb up over a rise which is Blue Mound or whatever it is in the southern suburbs of Chicago? You had a canal there that would come and lift up with the aid of locks up and over the mound and down the other side, and some of that sewage went into the Illinois River and then the Mississippi River and then into that big dead area in the Gulf of Mexico. So we've changed the environment, especially the water environment, and we have invasive creatures that come up that waterway, and one of them is a carp, which we've mentioned before. Yes, I see here. We have a little statement in the paper which says, the MacArthur Foundation is going to offer $100 million grant for an interesting project which will involve environment or critical problems affecting people, places, and the planet. I seriously think that if we could put together a rough, tough proposal for the area between Ohio and Iowa and south towards Alabama and north into Canada, that would be a fine project for the MacArthur Foundation to encourage. So here I am dreaming dreams that one should never dream, but we would like to think that that was a possibility. So in this whole act, I was thinking beautiful thoughts about railroad lines and talking to people about railroad lines, and we have the possibility of an abandonment at between Bonneville and Seymour, and we're trying like crazy to get the top flight company to take their grain out by railroad so that we can preserve 3 miles of railroad line. And when you're talking about Elizabeth Hanson and development, she didn't go into the interurbans and the main lines that brought everyone to town. It was unfortunate that the canals came a little earlier, and they hardly got into action before the railroads came in. The railroads were more flexible, but a lot of the people that came to settle in east central Illinois came by railroad. So there's a history there. So we'd like to bring historic trains into Champaign from White Heath, where great-grandmother and great-grandfather worked on the prairie in 1837. So how do we do this? Premier owns the elevators that control Bonneville. The two different organizations, and there's just this 3 mile of bed. And if we want to reconstruct rail bed from White Heath, where great-grandfather and great-grandmother settled, and re-rail that 4 miles so we can join up with 3 miles and get interesting trains into Champaign. We don't know where we would park them. We don't know what sort of trains would come in, but we have the thoughts to do that, and that would be a part of an extended proposal for this community. We think about Shady Rest, which is on the other side of White Heath, a picnic ground for the era when horses could only go 15 miles, and the railroad line goes through it. So, and there's Madden Creek, which comes in as a tributary, and it drains some of that very flat land that goes across towards Clinton. So we have to think about that as a part of a total picture. How do we relate that to Allerton Park? We have a high regard for sociological icons. We just lost, unfortunately, an elevator at Monticello that we dearly loved and hope to preserve and interpret, a wooden elevator. So there are these characteristic things. We know that the expansion will continue. Monticello is moving across from its old town in downtown Monticello. They've moved there a library already and bought a 30-acre gaming area where they can bring in teams from other communities. And so there will be a center that's near Route 72 and near a clover leaf, where eventually there'll probably be gas stations and the like. And there in the middle of that is a little prairie that has purple gentian on it and a whole bunch of other things. So how do we keep those things together and do interesting things with a nature corridor? How do we work with bicycles so that we can bicycle from Monticello, the west side of Monticello, or even the east side of Monticello and go towards Champaign, or the west side and go towards Decatur? How do we get to Monticello from Champaign? Well, the standard recommendation is to use Kirby Avenue, not Route 10, which is Springfield Avenue, because Route 10 is a very heavily used road and fairly narrow. So Kirby Avenue is a little quieter, and you can run into White Heath, which is kind of a historic town, and it has a Y. It allows a train to go in the direction of Clinton or in the direction of Decatur. And also is a triangle so that you can actually turn the train around, which is nice for people who are traveling on a train and like to see the train go forwards and not have a train push rail cars in an unnatural manner. So then there's 23 miles to Clinton, and we're talking about nuclear power. And this week in the state capitol, there was a bill from the power company to say we need subsidies. The price of energy has gone down, and so we're not making it with nuclear power. And if we don't get some subsidy from the state, we're going to close the power plant in Clinton. And that has something to do with how we work with a railroad bed that can join Clinton Power Plant Lake, Cooling Lake, with Weldon Spring State Park. That's an area where we might be thinking in 30, 40, 50 years. We're just wondering how we could make a proposal that is for 200 years. We need to do that. We need a regional planning. We can't just be confined to little pockets of jurisdiction that are ours. It has to be a jurisdiction that runs through East Central Illinois, like the Elizabeth Hanson book that said this is a valuable territory. This has this resource, natural resources, this development, and this potential, and we should preserve it. We should think about a national park there where you could run off the 57 at Kankakee and come down and see a prairie along the railroad line. You parallel on the old Route 45. And you stop off at Loda Cemetery, where there's a cemetery set aside that has a nice prairie on it. And then there's the same at Paxton, and then there's a parallel old Route 45, which is been retired. And that comes south to to Rantoul. And then there's a spur that goes east-west. It's the Pumpkin Vine, and it goes through Rantoul, Dillsburg, and up to Gifford, and on to a little short line prairie that's managed by the Grand Prairie Friends, just on the east side of Gifford and between Gifford and Penfield. And that's very near to where the little remnant prairies are that Elizabeth Hanson has been working. And I think we're very near to. So we hope you'll think about those things. And it's a little repetitive in a way, but I did go out to St. Joe, and I'm very pleased with action that's been taken there, even though there are people who are very disappointed that the trees are coming out. It's so much easier to do tree preservation because you can hug a tree, but you can't hug a prairie. But the prairie is our native ecosystem. So I go through the prairie with the thought of going to Mount Olive Cemetery and looking on from a little morainic hill, looking across at the railroad bed that's being developed. The stumps are being removed at the present time, and in the long run, we hope that this corridor will help us to restore a trail, or to create a trail on the 23 miles from Whiteheath to Clinton. So you have a regional network from Danville to Decatur to Allerton Park to Champaign-Urbana, and you have regional resources like railroads and even old interurbans. And we thank you for listening, and this has been Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. As always, the views and opinions expressed here are solely those of the speakers and nobody else.